Hi, my name is Fred Vey, and today I'm going to tell a story. The story of Granny Vey. Her name was Elizabeth, born in 1772, died 1874. She lived in County Carlow, Ireland, near the town of New Ross. Granny Vey was the first Vey to come to Newfoundland. And this is an interesting story that's been passed down through the family through the years. Anybody wishing to delve more deeply into this particular story, because it's an interesting story, I would recommend the research done by Les Vey from Long Beach. Les did a rather extensive research on the story of Granny Vey and on the Vey family. So he's written a couple of books on the subject, specifically a novel from Ireland with Vey, a very interesting book. You might care to read it. My purpose is to tell the story, the basis of Granny Vey's story that's been passed down through the Vey family in Greats Cove. A gentleman, Walt Hodder, who came from Greats Cove and lived in Montreal, did some research on the Vey family tree in Greats Cove. And I myself have done a little research, basically transcribing headstones and taped interviews with older members of the Vey family. In the early 1970s, I interviewed my grandfather, John Vey, born in 1882, died 1980. Now, he was a storyteller, and he loved to tell the story of Granny Vey. So what I'm going to do now is read to you, basically, the transcribed version of a taped interview that I did with him. The story of the Vey family has its beginning in Ireland, where the roots of many Newfoundland families are located. The story revolves around a Vey family consisting of a lady, Granny Vey. Her name was Elizabeth, her husband, and her two sons, John and James. The early 19th century was a troublesome time in Ireland, plagued not only by the aged Catholic Protestant turmoil, but there were problems with potato crops, and of course major problems with land ownership. Britain had passed the penal laws, and this resulted in basically absentee landlordship. It caused all kinds of problems. A conflict developed between the Vey family, who were members of the Protestant sect, and a group of Irish Catholics. It reached its climax approximately in the late 1820s, maybe 1830, when a large band of men visited the Vey home with the intention of murdering Mr. Vey. When the trouble began, Mrs. Vey hid with her two sons under the steps leading to their home, while her husband confronted the enemy. A struggle ensued, which resulted in the death of Mr. Vey, witnessed by both his wife and his sons, who related a very vivid account of the tragedy to their descendants. Now, Mr. Vey was a big, raw-boned man who had served time in the army and had in his possession an army musket with a bayonet. Upon seeing trouble brewing, he hid his family and confronted the enemy with bayonet fixed. He was forced by the sword-swinging group of Catholics. They possessed no firearm, down a beach by his home and out into the water. Standing with the water washing at his armpits, he put up a strong defense until he eventually was slain. His huge frame and bayoneted musket provided him with a longer reach than his enemy, and his sons reported that he actually threw several men high over his head. Mr. Vey killed 7 of the men attacking him before collapsing in the water. His determination to live was great, and discussion of the battle has generated much conversation among his descendants, although the number slain may not be correct. It has been repeated many times, and the descendants romantically were inclined to believe that he sold his life dearly. Mrs. Vey and her sons were forced to use extreme caution in avoiding the men that had slain her husband. In order to leave the immediate area of her home, she had to get spruce boughs, which they placed between themselves and the enemy, thereby slipping through the Catholic group. It was with great relief they vacated the area, carrying with them their only the clothes on their back, and 1 glass decanter containing water, covered with twine mesh. Mrs. Vey and her sons made their way by foot and boat to the community of Bristol, England. This must have been accomplished on foot because they had no money and only kindness to depend on. The hardships suffered along the way can only be imagined and remembered in terms of a pressing need for survival. Arriving in Bristol, Mrs. Vey contacted her brother, who was captain of a merchant schooner that ran from England to Newfoundland, and arranged for transportation with him to that far-off place where she had heard that jewels hung from the trees. Of course, she'd heard this from the fishermen who would come over every year and return. She was talking about the icicles on the trees, glitter. Her husband, a reason for choosing Newfoundland is unknown, other than a desire to get away from Ireland as far and as quickly as possible. Her brother provided the passage money, and of course this could have been the main motive behind the move. The name of the ship on which the immigrants crossed the North Atlantic is unknown, but there were other passengers on board. Cargo was stored in the hold of the vessel, above which a floor was placed, and on this the passengers endured the crossing, sleeping on their clothes and other belongings. They were allowed on deck only during fine weather and to boil water. Granny paid a fee of 10 shillings and 6 for the trip, and was landed in Briggs Conception Bay, Newfoundland, because it was the first port of call. Moving on foot and searching for some means to make a living, she went to Carbonair and hired her sons out to 2 fishermen in that community. Remaining there for 1 year only, she moved on to Western Bay, where she again hired out her sons during the fishing season. Hearing tales of much fish being caught at Great's Cove, she moved there with her sons the following spring, carrying their worldly possessions on their back. Taking in a small plot of land in Great's Cove, today referred to as up across the rocks, they built a sod tilt, which was to be their home for some years. The luxury enjoyed in that dwelling might best be indicated by their only window, which consisted of an old iron kettle built into the sods. One of the boys had been down in the beach and picked up an old iron kettle, and they took it and they put the sods around it, and that became their only window. On fine days, the cover would be taken off and the sun would shine in, and on bad days, it would be replaced. Mrs. Vey worked for the ladies of the community by washing their clothes in their homes, while John and James worked with fishermen. James, worked with the Stiles' family and eventually married a daughter, Lavinia Stiles. John fished with a Benson family and eventually married one of their daughters, Margaret Benson. Now, John and James both lived with their families in Grace Cove for a number of years. There was no wood in Grace Cove. The fishermen needed wood for their stages and flakes and so on. Every year, schooners would go up to the bottom of Trinity Bay and gather up this wood and bring it back to the people of Grace Cove. James must have made that trip because for some reason, approximately around 1860, he took his family and his mother, Granny, and he moved to Long Beach, which is right up in the bottom of Trinity Bay. And spent the rest of his life in that community. He built a water mill, sawmill, built boats, and generally prospered in that town. He was the first resident of Long Beach, and he's buried there now, basically on his own property by the side of the road. Grave is still marked there. Granny Vey died October the 15th, 1874. Her grandson, living in Grace Cove, Ebenezer, rose early in the morning and looking out his window, saw a schooner coming into Grace Cove with its flag, the Union Jack, flying at half-mast. This proved to be Granny Vey returning to Grace Cove to be buried. She had lived to be 102 years old, an age not attained by any Vey since. Her health had been failing the previous summer, and Ebenezer had been notified that she wanted to be buried in Grace Cove. Her reason for wishing that community to be her final resting place was because it had a cemetery that could be called consecrated ground. Long Beach, where she had been living, did not have a cemetery and was not consecrated. Remember now that James was the first settler in that community. Granny Vey had stated that if she died during the winter, she was to be buried in the snow only, until such time that a boat could get through the ice and transport her to Grace Cove. She died in the late fall and was brought to Grace Cove within a few days. When Ebenezer stepped through his door that morning, he saw the minister standing in the road and correctly assumed that Granny Vey had died. He contacted him before going down to where the schooner was landing. Some men were rounded up. The grave was uncovered. It had been dug the previous fall, or that fall, early in the fall, and covered in anticipation of her death. Granny Vey was put to rest before the crew of the schooner received anything to eat. After the funeral, the crew went to Ebenezer's house where his wife had prepared a meal. During the morning, the wind had gone around to the southwest which was a fair wind home. And the schooner was back in Long Beach before the day was out. Granny Vey was buried beneath a tree in the old Anglican cemetery in Great Skull. The trees were pretty scarce in Great Skull. The cemetery bordered on the Vey property, and her grave is very close to that border. The grave was never marked, but the location is well known.